Police officer harasses black woman in court. Until she stands up and reveals she's an FBI agent. How far can someone go when they believe they're untouchable? In a quiet courtroom, a powerful officer uses his authority to harass a black woman, certain she's just another face in the crowd. But as the tension rises and the courtroom holds its breath, she stands up and reveals a truth that no one saw coming, turning the entire trial on its head. What unfolds next is a stunning clash of power, justice, and karma. Stay with me, because this story is about to take a turn you won't believe. The morning sun glinted off the towering facade of the Richmond County Courthouse, its columns casting long shadows over the steps below. The air was crisp, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the crowd gathering outside. Lawyers clutching thick case files, families murmuring nervously, and officers stationed at the entrance, scanning the faces of all who entered. Maya Collins approached the courthouse with a calm stride, her polished black heels clicking softly against the concrete. Her tailored navy suit hugged her athletic frame, exuding quiet confidence. A sleek black leather bag was slung over her shoulder, containing carefully organized files and something far more important, her FBI credentials. Despite her composed exterior, her sharp brown eyes scanned her surroundings with the precision of someone trained to observe every detail. This wasn't just another court appearance for her. It was part of an ongoing operation, and today she needed to remain invisible. But her anonymity wouldn't last long. As Maya reached the security checkpoint, she was met by a line of metal detectors and a handful of uniformed officers directing the steady stream of people. Most of the officers appeared indifferent, their movements robotic after countless shifts. All but one. Officer Tyler Green stood at the center of the checkpoint, his tall, broad frame filling the space as though it were his personal domain. His neatly pressed uniform did little to soften the hard angles of his face or the sharpness in his pale blue eyes. He had the air of a man who enjoyed the power his position afforded him, perhaps too much. Maya stepped into the line, her expression neutral as she approached the checkpoint. She placed her bag on the conveyor belt and waited for it to pass through the scanner. "Ma'am," Green's voice cut through the low hum of conversation, sharp and authoritative. "Step aside." Maya blinked, her face giving away nothing. "Is there a problem, officer?" Green's eyes narrowed, a smirk curling one side of his mouth. "That bag of yours looks a little too heavy for a quick visit. What's in it?" Maya maintained her calm, her voice steady. "Just documents for a hearing. Everything is laid out for inspection." Green crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "Documents, huh? Mind if I take a closer look?" Before she could respond, he gestured for another officer to stop the conveyor belt. Maya felt a flicker of annoyance but pushed it aside. She had encountered men like Green before, officers who thrived on exerting control in unnecessary ways. This wasn't her first test of patience, and it wouldn't be her last. "Go ahead," Maya said, stepping aside to give him space. Green rifled through her bag with exaggerated movements, pulling out folders and personal items as though searching for contraband. A few people in the line glanced over, curious about the commotion, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Maya remained still, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. "Big shot lawyer, huh?" Green said, holding up a folder labeled FBI Confidential. His tone dripped with mockery. "Or just trying to look the part?" Maya's eyes met his, cool and unflinching. "That folder is confidential. I'd appreciate it if you handled it with care." "Confidential, huh?" Green chuckled, ignoring her request as he opened the folder and flipped through the documents. "What exactly are you hiding, ma'am?" At that moment, the murmurs around them grew louder. A few people whispered, glancing nervously at Green's blatant disregard for protocol. One officer nearby hesitated, his hand twitching at his side as if he wanted to intervene but didn't dare cross Green. Maya took a slow breath, keeping her voice level. "Officer, if you've finished your inspection, I'd like to proceed. I have a hearing to attend." Green snapped the folder shut and tossed it back into her bag carelessly. "Not so fast." His tone was sharper now, a hint of frustration creeping in. He reached into her bag again and pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a gold badge embedded in blue enamel with the words Federal Bureau of Investigation engraved in bold letters. The smirk on his face faltered for a split second before returning with forced bravado. Nice prop. Where'd you pick this up? A flea market? The tension in the room thickened. Maya's fingers twitched at her sides, but she remained composed. Her voice dropped, low and firm. That badge is real, Officer Green, and unless you'd like to escalate this further, I suggest you let me through. Green's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning her face as though searching for a crack in her composure. When he found none, he scoffed and tossed the wallet back into her bag. Fine, he said, stepping aside. But don't think you're above the law just because you carry a shiny badge. Maya didn't respond. She adjusted her bag, her movements deliberate, and walked past the checkpoint without a word. The whispers behind her followed her up the stairs and into the courtroom. As Maya entered the courtroom, she allowed herself a small exhale. She had kept her composure, but the encounter had left a bitter taste in her mouth. Men like Green weren't just nuisances. They were part of the problem, a symptom of a larger issue she was here to confront. Little did Green know, his actions had just cemented his role in something much bigger than he could imagine. For now, Maya would wait. Her moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would be Green who found himself on trial. Maya stepped into the courtroom, the door closing softly behind her, but the sound seemed to echo in her mind. The courtroom was modest, with polished wooden benches arranged in neat rows. The faint scent of varnish hung in the air, mingling with the low hum of whispered conversations. At the front, a large mahogany desk stood as a symbol of justice, flanked by flags of the United States and the state of Georgia. She scanned the room quickly, her gaze sweeping over the faces of lawyers, plaintiffs, and spectators. Most were absorbed in their own matters, but a few heads turned as she walked in, their eyes lingering on her just a moment too long. It wasn't unusual. Maya was used to standing out. Her poise, her confidence, and yes, her skin color often drew attention in spaces where power was tightly held. Taking a seat toward the back, Maya placed her bag carefully beside her. She wasn't here to attract attention. Not yet. For now, she needed to blend into the background and observe. This courtroom, like so many others, had its own rhythm, its own unspoken rules. She knew better than to disrupt that, at least until the time was right. Up front, Judge Carolyn Spencer presided over the courtroom with a calm authority. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she read through a stack of papers. Though Judge Spencer was known for her fairness, Maya also knew the woman had a no-nonsense approach to courtroom decorum. Disruptions, no matter how justified, would not be tolerated. Maya's eyes flicked to the plaintiff's table, where a middle-aged man in a cheap gray suit shuffled through his notes. He looked nervous, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the table, as he glanced toward the opposing counsel. At the defense table sat a man in his early 40s, his tailored suit and confident smirk exuding privilege. He leaned back in his chair as if he owned the room, occasionally whispering to his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s. Maya had reviewed their files before coming here. The plaintiff, Mr. Robert Ellis, was a whistleblower, a former employee of a construction company alleging corruption and fraud in the awarding of government contracts. The defense, represented by the company's CEO, Derek Hanlon, had pulled every trick in the book to discredit Ellis. They had used their influence to smear his reputation and drag out the case, hoping to exhaust him into submission. This was no ordinary civil case. It was a thread in a much larger web of corruption that Maya and her team had been unraveling for months. She was here not only to support Ellis, but also to testify, if needed, about her findings. And as fate would have it, she had another matter to attend to in this very courtroom. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. She didn't need to turn to know who had entered. The low murmur of voices was enough. Officer Green had followed her. She could feel his presence like a storm cloud gathering behind her. Maya resisted the urge to glance back, knowing it would only embolden him. Instead, she focused on the proceedings as Judge Spencer called the court to order. As the first witness was called to the stand, Maya took out a notebook and began jotting down notes. The testimony was predictable. Technical details about contracts and irregularities that painted a clear picture of corporate malfeasance. But as compelling as the evidence was, it was clear the defense was prepared to muddy the waters. Their attorney's cross-examination was ruthless, twisting the witnesses' words and planting seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. Maya's pen moved steadily across the page, her thoughts focused. But out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement. Green had taken a seat near the door, his posture relaxed but his eyes fixed on her. She didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge him, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. He wasn't here to protect the courthouse or enforce security. He was here for her. Minutes ticked by, and the tension in the room seemed to thicken. Maya kept her focus on the case, but Green's presence gnawed at the edges of her concentration. His arrogance, his blatant disrespect, it was a reminder of why she did this work, why she had chosen this path. People like him thrived in systems that allowed them to wield unchecked power. Today, she would remind him, and everyone else in this room, that such power had limits. During a brief recess, the courtroom emptied out, leaving only a few people behind. Maya remained seated, reviewing her notes while Green sauntered over. His boots echoed against the wooden floor, each step deliberate, calculated. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands resting on his belt. "Still here, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Figured you'd have second thoughts about sticking around." Maya looked up slowly, meeting his gaze. Her expression was calm, unreadable. "Is there something you need, officer?" Green smirked, leaning in slightly. "Just doing my job, making sure everything's in order. You know, it's funny. People like you always seem to think you're above the rules." Maya set her pen down and folded her hands in her lap. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. "And what exactly do you mean by people like me, officer?" Green shrugged, feigning innocence. "You know what I mean. You walk in here flashing fake credentials, acting like you own the place. I've seen your type before." Maya's gaze didn't waver. "You're stepping on very thin ice, officer. I'd advise you to think carefully before you say anything else." Green chuckled, shaking his head. "Is that a threat?" "No," Maya said, her tone icy. "It's a warning." For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Green stared at her, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. But before he could respond, the courtroom doors swung open, and the clerk announced the end of the recess. Maya rose from her seat, smoothing her suit jacket. She didn't spare Green another glance as she walked past him and returned to her place. The game had begun, and Green had no idea just how outmatched he was. The courtroom was alive again with the hum of voices as people filed back in from the recess. The sharp rap of Judge Spencer's gavel brought the noise to a halt, and everyone settled into their seats. Maya adjusted her blazer and crossed her legs, her notepad resting on her lap. The encounter with Officer Green still lingered in the back of her mind, but she locked her focus on the case at hand. As the plaintiff's attorney, a young man named Daniel Reyes, rose to call his next witness, Maya noticed the subtle shift in the courtroom. The defense team exchanged hushed whispers, their body language stiff. Maya knew this moment was critical. Reyes was calling Evan Matthews, a former contractor who had worked closely with Derek Hanlon's company. Matthews was the key witness, the one who could confirm the corruption allegations. But Maya also knew the defense would do everything in their power to discredit him. Matthews took the stand, his nervousness apparent in the way he adjusted his tie and avoided eye contact. He was an unassuming man in his mid-30s, with dark circles under his eyes and a slightly hunched posture. Years of working in an industry riddled with cutthroat competition and backroom deals had taken their toll. Reyes began his questioning gently, easing Matthews into the testimony. "Mr. Matthews, can you confirm that you were employed by Hanlon Construction between 2018 and 2022? "Yes," Matthews said, his voice steady but quiet. "I worked as a project manager." "And during your time there, Did you witness any irregularities in the awarding of government contracts? Matthews hesitated, glancing toward the defense table. Hanlon leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of indifference, but Maya noticed the subtle clench of his jaw. The room held its collective breath as Matthews finally nodded. Yes, he said. I was instructed to alter bid proposals to ensure we won certain contracts. The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. Reyes pressed on, guiding Matthews through the details, specific projects, inflated costs, and the directives that came straight from Hanlon's office. Each answer painted a damning picture, and Maya could see the jury leaning in, their expressions hardening with every word. When it was the defense attorney's turn to cross-examine, the atmosphere shifted again. Linda Carver, a seasoned litigator with a sharp tongue, approached the witness stand with calculated precision. Mr. Matthews, Carver began, her tone dripping with feigned politeness. You've admitted to altering bid proposals. Would you agree that this means you knowingly participated in illegal activities? Matthews swallowed hard. I was following orders. Following orders, Carver repeated, her voice rising slightly. And yet you never reported these alleged orders to the authorities. Why is that? I was afraid of losing my job, Matthews stammered. Carver pounced. So you were more concerned about your paycheck than about upholding the law? Isn't it possible, Mr. Matthews, that you're only coming forward now because you're bitter about being let go? Maya watched as Matthews faltered under Carver's relentless questioning. His answers became more hesitant, his credibility slowly eroding. The defense's strategy was clear: sow doubt, attack his character, and shift the focus away from the evidence. It was a tactic Maya had seen countless times before, and it never failed to ignite a quiet fury within her. But this time she wasn't just a spectator. She was here to ensure the truth prevailed. As the cross-examination continued, Maya felt a presence looming behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Officer Green. He had taken up a spot near the back of the courtroom, leaning casually against the wall as though he belonged there. His eyes were fixed on her, a smug expression etched on his face. Maya forced herself to remain composed. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of reacting, but his persistence was becoming a distraction. She glanced toward the judge's bench where Judge Spencer was observing the proceedings with a critical eye. The judge's reputation for fairness reassured Maya, but even Spencer couldn't intervene in matters outside the courtroom. For now, Green was a problem she'd have to deal with later. The cross-examination ended, and Matthews stepped down from the witness stand, visibly shaken. Reyes did his best to reassure him with a firm pat on the shoulder, but the damage had been done. The defense had succeeded in planting seeds of doubt, and Maya could see it in the jury's uncertain expressions. As the court moved to admit new evidence, Maya leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. She knew the importance of timing, of waiting for the right moment to act. Her presence here wasn't just about supporting the case. It was about ensuring that justice couldn't be buried under a pile of legal maneuvering and intimidation. The next witness was called, a forensic accountant who would lay out the financial discrepancies in meticulous detail. As the testimony unfolded, Maya's attention was momentarily drawn to the courtroom doors. Two men in dark suits entered quietly, their movements deliberate. Maya recognized them instantly. They were part of her team. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her face neutral. Their presence meant one thing: the operation was moving forward. During another brief recess, Maya rose from her seat and made her way toward the hallway. She needed a moment to regroup, to prepare for what was coming. But as she reached the door, Green intercepted her, stepping into her path with a self-satisfied smirk. "Heading out already?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Thought you'd stick around to see how this circus ends." Maya looked up at him, her expression calm but unyielding. "Step aside, officer." Green didn't move. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You think flashing that badge of yours makes you untouchable? Newsflash, sweetheart. You're not special. You're just another. That's enough." The voice came from behind Green, sharp and commanding. One of the men in dark suits stepped forward, his badge flashing briefly as he held it up. "Special Agent Davis, FBI. I suggest you choose your next words carefully, officer." Green froze, the color draining from his face. He straightened up, his smirk replaced by a look of uncertainty. Maya took the opportunity to step past him, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she walked away without a backward glance. The storm was building, and soon it would break. Maya walked down the polished marble hallway, her heels tapping rhythmically, each step steady and deliberate. The faint echo was the only sound that accompanied her, save for the hum of distant voices spilling faintly from the courtroom. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, her posture impeccable. From the outside, she looked composed, unshaken. Inside, however, she could feel the undercurrent of tension building, like a current pulling her toward an inevitable confrontation. At the far end of the hallway, sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long beams of light across the floor. Maya paused in the middle of the corridor and let the cool air steady her. She needed these few moments, a brief reprieve to recalibrate her focus. Green's taunts, the courtroom's subtle pressure, and the defense's calculated theatrics were all distractions designed to pull her off course. But Maya was no stranger to these tactics. She had weathered far worse in her career, and she wasn't about to falter now. The faint sound of approaching footsteps caught her attention, and she turned just as Special Agent Davis appeared at her side. Dressed in a crisp black suit, he moved with quiet authority, his expression calm but serious. "Everything in place?" Maya asked, her voice low. Davis nodded. "We've got eyes on him. He doesn't realize it yet, but his every move is being monitored. The evidence against him is solid. All we need is for him to step out of line one more time." Maya's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "That shouldn't take long." Davis allowed himself a small chuckle, though his gaze remained watchful. "You sure you want to keep this low-key? We can bring him in now if you're ready." "No," Maya said firmly, her tone leaving no room for debate. "I want this to happen on my terms. Green's been walking around with unchecked arrogance for too long. If we act too soon, he'll spin this as an overreaction or play the victim. I want him to expose himself fully, in front of everyone." Davis nodded again, his respect for her approach clear. "Understood. Just give the signal when you're ready." He handed her a small device, a discreet communication earpiece, and slipped away as quietly as he had come, leaving Maya alone once more. She held the earpiece in her hand for a moment, studying its smooth, matte surface. Then, with practiced ease, she tucked it behind her ear, letting her hair fall naturally to conceal it. Maya re-entered the courtroom just as the forensic accountant was wrapping up their testimony. The charts and graphs displayed on the screen behind the witness stand were damning, clear evidence of financial discrepancies that tied directly to Derek Hanlon's company. The jury's expressions were a mix of curiosity and unease as they processed the detailed breakdown. Maya slid into her seat near the back, her presence barely registering to most in the room. But not to Green. He was still there, stationed by the door like a shadow that refused to fade. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his eyes tracked her every move, though the smugness in his gaze had dimmed ever so slightly. Maya ignored him, her attention fully on the proceedings. Reyes was doing an admirable job of reinforcing the forensic evidence, and she made mental notes of the points she could later corroborate if called to the stand. The web of corruption was unraveling, thread by thread, and Maya could see the cracks beginning to form in Hanlon's carefully constructed facade. When it came time for the defense's cross-examination, Carver once again took the floor with her characteristic precision. She attacked the evidence with calculated skepticism, raising questions about methodologies and attempting to cast doubt on the forensic accountant's expertise. It was a predictable strategy, and though it landed a few minor blows, it lacked the weight to undo the damage already done. Still, Maya watched closely, her sharp eyes noting every tactic and angle Carver employed. The defense was playing for time, hoping to muddy the waters enough to confuse the jury. but Maya knew that time was a luxury they wouldn't have for much longer. As the court adjourned for another recess, Maya rose from her seat, gathering her notes. She was preparing to step out when a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Agent Collins." She turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral. Officer Green stood a few feet away, his hands resting on his belt, his posture deceptively casual. But there was an edge to his tone, a thinly veiled hostility that made it clear he wasn't finished with her. "Yes, officer?" Maya said calmly. Green took a step closer, his smirk returning. "You think you're clever, don't you? Walking in here like you own the place, flashing that badge around." "I haven't flashed anything," Maya replied, her voice steady. "You're the one who seems fixated on my presence." Green's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "You're not as untouchable as you think, Collins. People like you always think you can get away with anything, but this is my courthouse, and I don't take kindly to outsiders trying to throw their weight around." Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Is that a threat, Officer Green?" "It's a warning," he shot back, his voice lowering. "You'd do well to remember who's in charge here." For a moment the hallway was silent, the tension between them palpable. Then slowly Maya took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Let me tell you something, officer," she said, her tone quiet but laced with steel. "The moment you decided to abuse your authority, you lost any claim to being in charge. You've been playing a dangerous game and you don't even realize the ground you're standing on is about to crumble." Green's smirk disappeared completely, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Before he could respond, Maya brushed past him and walked away, her steps confident and unhurried. Back in the hallway, Maya tapped her earpiece, her voice calm and precise. "This is Collins. We're ready to proceed. Keep your eyes on Green. He's about to make his final mistake." Davis's voice came through, steady and professional. "Copy that. We're in position." Maya allowed herself a small smile as she headed toward the courtroom's private conference room. The storm she had been holding back was finally about to break, and when it did, Officer Green wouldn't know what hit him. The courtroom was beginning to fill again, its air thick with anticipation. Maya re-entered with the same measured grace, her steps purposeful as she returned to her seat near the back. The attorneys were already arranging their files, the hum of whispered conversations echoing softly against the wooden walls. The jury, now more attentive than ever, exchanged quiet glances, the weight of the evidence hanging over them like a storm cloud. Maya slid into her seat, setting her bag beside her. She smoothed the front of her blazer, her fingers grazing the hidden earpiece tucked beneath her hair. Davis's voice had gone quiet for now, but she knew the team was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Green was still stationed by the door, though his posture had shifted. He was no longer lounging with that casual arrogance. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze darting between Maya and the other occupants of the room. She could sense his unease, though he was doing his best to hide it. As Judge Spencer called the court to order, Linda Carver rose to her feet with the same air of confidence she'd displayed throughout the trial. Her tailored navy suit was immaculate, and her sharp eyes scanned the room as she approached the front. Carver was the type of litigator who thrived under pressure, and it was clear she intended to go out swinging. "Your Honor," she began, her voice crisp and controlled. "The defense would like to call a rebuttal witness to address the allegations raised by Mr. Matthews." The plaintiff's attorney, Daniel Reyes, immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed during discovery." Carver smiled thinly. "The witness is being called to refute claims made during today's testimony. This is well within the bounds of rebuttal." Judge Spencer leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll allow it, but proceed carefully, Miss Carver. The court does not appreciate surprises." "Of course, Your Honor," Carver said, her smile unwavering. She turned to the back of the courtroom. "The defense calls Officer Tyler Green to the stand." A ripple of surprise spread through the room, the jurors exchanging puzzled glances. Maya's expression didn't change, but internally her focus sharpened. So this was their play, a desperate attempt to use Green as a character witness to discredit Matthews. It was a bold move, but also a reckless one. Green straightened, his posture stiff as he made his way to the front. He avoided looking at Maya as he passed her, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. He climbed into the witness stand, his movements deliberate, as though trying to project confidence. After being sworn in, Green settled into his seat, his hands resting on the arms of the chair. Carver wasted no time. "Officer Green," she began, her tone warm and conversational. "How long have you been stationed at the Richmond County Courthouse?" 6 years, Green replied, his voice steady but lacking its usual bravado. "And in those 6 years, have you had the opportunity to interact with many of the individuals involved in today's case?" "Yes, ma'am," Green said. "I've interacted with Mr. Matthews, the plaintiff's attorney, and others connected to this case." Carver nodded. "And in your professional opinion, would you say Mr. Matthews is a credible individual?" Green hesitated, just long enough for the room to notice. "No," he said finally. "I've seen him around the courthouse before, and he's always struck me as unreliable." Carver smiled, her expression triumphant. "Could you elaborate on that, officer?" "Well," Green said, leaning forward slightly, "he's been known to get nervous, forget details, and frankly, he doesn't carry himself like someone who's telling the whole truth. I wouldn't trust him if I were the jury." Maya's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of her notebook. Green's words were calculated, rehearsed, but they were also riddled with assumptions and bias. She could see the faint smirk beginning to creep back onto his face, his confidence returning as he played to the defense's hand. But Green didn't know he was walking straight into a trap. Carver continued her questioning, drawing out more of Green's observations, each one designed to undermine Matthews' credibility. The jury was listening, their expressions a mix of skepticism and intrigue. But Maya knew it was only a matter of time before the tide turned. At last, it was Reyes's turn to cross-examine. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie before approaching the witness stand. His expression was calm, measured, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "Officer Green," Reyes began, his voice steady, "you've stated that you've interacted with individuals connected to this case. Can you clarify the nature of these interactions?" Green shrugged. "Mostly casual. Just observations I've made while doing my job." "Observations," Reyes repeated, nodding. "And would you say these observations are based on objective facts, or are they influenced by your personal opinions?" Green frowned slightly. "I call it like I see it. If someone seems shady, it's because they probably are." "I see," Reyes said, his tone light but probing. "And would you consider yourself an unbiased observer, Officer Green?" "Of course," Green said quickly, though his tone wavered slightly. Reyes paused, letting the room sit in silence for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of papers. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to introduce new evidence that directly pertains to Officer Green's credibility as a witness." Judge Spencer raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Reyes handed the papers to the court clerk, who distributed copies to the judge and the defense. As Carver scanned the documents, her confident expression faltered for the first time. Green shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "These are records," Reyes continued, "of multiple complaints filed against Officer Green during his tenure at the courthouse. Complaints alleging racial profiling, abuse of power, and harassment." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Green's face turned pale, his jaw tightening as he glared at Reyes. "This is outrageous," Carver exclaimed, rising from her seat. "These records are irrelevant and prejudicial." "They go directly to the credibility of your witness, Miss Carver," Reyes interrupted, his voice firm. "The jury has a right to know the full context of who they're being asked to trust." Judge Spencer held up a hand, silencing the room. "I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Reyes." Reyes turned back to Green, his tone sharpened. "Officer Green, would you like to address these complaints? Do you deny that multiple individuals have accused you of misconduct?" Green's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. "Those complaints," "They're exaggerated," he muttered. "People don't like being told to follow the rules." Reyes stepped closer, his voice rising. "Are they exaggerated, officer? Or are they the result of the same unchecked arrogance we've seen here today?" Green opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of the evidence, the murmurs of the jury, and the steely gaze of Judge Spencer bore down on him. From her seat, Maya watched the unraveling with quiet satisfaction. Green's fall had begun, and there was no stopping it now. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Green sat stiffly in the witness stand. His confidence eroded under the weight of the newly revealed complaints. His hands gripped the edges of the chair, the tension visible in the tight set of his jaw and the twitch of his fingers. For a man who had thrived on projecting control, he now looked like a cornered animal, his gaze darting nervously between the defense table and Judge Spencer's unwavering stare. Reyes took a deliberate step closer, his presence commanding but controlled. He held the courtroom's attention with the precision of a seasoned litigator, his every word calculated to dismantle Green's credibility piece by piece. "Officer Green," Reyes began, his voice calm but pointed. "You testified that you are an unbiased observer, correct?" Green shifted uncomfortably, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Yes," he muttered, though the conviction in his voice was gone. "And yet," Reyes continued, holding up the documents, "these complaints suggest a troubling pattern of behavior that undermines the very neutrality you claim to uphold. Let's take one specific incident. In 2022, a formal complaint was filed against you for allegedly targeting a black attorney who was entering this very courthouse. Do you recall that incident?" Green's face flushed and he clenched his jaw tightly. I don't remember every complaint. People file things all the time to get back at officers." Reyes tilted his head, his tone growing sharper. "You don't remember? Let me refresh your memory. According to the report, you accused this individual of cutting the security line and subjected them to an invasive bag search. Sound familiar?" Green hesitated, his gaze flicking to Carver as though silently pleading for her intervention. But Carver remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked as though she was calculating her next move, but even she seemed to know that this moment was slipping out of her control. "I was doing my job," Green said finally, his voice defensive. "If someone doesn't follow the rules, I have the right to question them." Reyes raised an eyebrow, his tone turning icy. "The rules or your own assumptions? Because it seems, Officer Green, that your rules only apply selectively, particularly when it comes to certain individuals." The murmur of the courtroom grew louder, the jurors exchanging glances. Green's face darkened, his composure unraveling further. From her seat, Maya remained still, her expression unreadable. But inside, she felt the tide shifting in her favor. Judge Spencer raised her gavel and the noise in the room immediately subsided. Her sharp gaze fixed on Green, her tone firm. "Officer Green, I remind you that you are under oath. The court takes these allegations very seriously, and I expect honest answers." "Yes, Your Honor," Green mumbled, his voice barely audible. Reyes continued, his voice unwavering. "Let's move to another complaint, Officer Green. In this case, you were accused of making racially charged comments toward a courthouse employee. Do you deny this allegation?" Green's head snapped up, his voice rising defensively. "I deny it. People twist words all the time trying to make officers look bad. It's not fair." "Not fair," Reyes echoed, his tone hardening. "Is it fair for you to use your position to target and demean individuals based on your own biases? Is it fair for those people to endure humiliation and intimidation simply because you call it like you see it?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Green didn't respond. His hands gripped the chair tighter, his knuckles white. As the tension in the room reached a boiling point, Reyes stepped back, his cross-examination complete. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, returning to his seat. Judge Spencer glanced at the defense table. "Does the defense wish to redirect?" Carver hesitated, then slowly rose. She approached the witness stand, her expression carefully neutral. "Officer Green, I understand this has been a difficult line of questioning, she began, her tone softening. But I want to give you the opportunity to clarify. In your time as a courthouse officer, have you ever acted outside the bounds of your authority? Green seized on the lifeline, his voice growing stronger. No, I haven't. I've always done my job to the best of my ability. People don't like being held accountable. And that's where these complaints come from. It's not about what I've done. It's about them not liking the rules. Carver nodded, offering him a reassuring smile. Thank you, Officer Green. No further questions. Maya's gaze followed Carver as she returned to the defense table, her steps less confident than before. The defense was on shaky ground, and everyone in the room knew it. Judge Spencer addressed the court. Does the plaintiff wish to call any additional witnesses? Reyes stood, but instead of responding, he turned to Maya. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Special Agent Maya Collins to the stand. A ripple of surprise swept through the room. Green's head whipped around, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Maya rose from her seat, her movements calm and deliberate. She picked up her bag and walked to the front of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the floor. As she was sworn in, she caught Green's gaze. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and she could see the realization dawning on him. The storm he had ignored for so long was finally here, and it was bearing down on him with full force. Reyes approached her, his demeanor respectful. Special Agent Collins, can you state your role and position for the court? Maya folded her hands neatly on the edge of the witness stand. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Anti-Corruption Task Force. And what is your purpose in attending this trial today? My team and I have been investigating systemic corruption involving Hanlon Construction and other entities, including certain individuals associated with this courthouse. Reyes nodded, his voice steady. Are you familiar with Officer Tyler Green? Maya's gaze flicked briefly to Green before returning to Reyes. Yes, I am. Can you elaborate on your interactions with him? Maya's voice remained calm but firm as she recounted her experiences. Green's unnecessary bag searches, his condescending remarks, and his overt attempts to assert dominance. Each detail painted a picture of a man who abused his power, and each word landed like a blow against Green's rapidly crumbling facade. The jurors leaned forward, their attention fixed on Maya. Her composed demeanor, combined with her precise recounting of events, lent her testimony an air of undeniable credibility. Even the defense seemed unable to mount an effective rebuttal, their earlier confidence eroded by the weight of the evidence. As Maya finished her testimony, Reyes turned to the judge. Your Honor, the plaintiff rests. Judge Spencer nodded, her expression unreadable. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. As the courtroom emptied, Green remained frozen in the witness stand, his face a mask of disbelief. Maya stood, gathering her belongings with the same quiet grace she had displayed throughout the day. She didn't look at Green as she left the courtroom, but she could feel his eyes on her, the weight of his defeat settling heavily on his shoulders. The courtroom was quiet the next morning, a stark contrast to the murmurs and tension that had filled the room the day before. The weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, as if the very walls of the courthouse had absorbed the storm of revelations. Each person who entered walked with purpose, their steps slower, their conversations hushed. The trial's final day was here, and everyone knew it would leave a mark. Maya arrived early, her polished demeanor as impeccable as ever. Her navy suit, pressed to perfection, and the gleaming badge subtly pinned to the inside of her jacket served as silent reminders of who she was and what she represented. Today wasn't just about closing arguments or the verdict, it was about exposing truth, holding power to account, and ensuring justice was served. As she stepped into the courtroom, her eyes instinctively sought out the jury. Their faces betrayed the mental tug-of-war they were enduring, weighing the evidence, the testimonies, and their own biases. Maya had been in countless courtrooms, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reflection of a system riddled with cracks, A system that allowed men like Derek Hanlon and Officer Tyler Green to operate unchecked for far too long. Linda Carver stood at the defense table, her hands clasping a file folder so tightly that her knuckles whitened. For the first time during the trial, the sharp, commanding litigator looked tense. The confidence she had wielded with such ease earlier now felt more like a fragile veneer. When Judge Spencer entered the courtroom and called it to order, Carver wasted no time. She rose and walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady despite the subtle tremor beneath it. "You've heard a great deal of testimony over the past few days, and while the plaintiff has worked hard to paint my client, Mr. Hanlon, and Officer Green in an unfavorable light, I urge you to focus on the facts." Carver's tone softened, becoming almost imploring. "The defense is not here to argue that mistakes haven't been made. No system is perfect, and no individual is without flaws. But to label my client and Officer Green as corrupt, as abusive based on a handful of allegations and assumptions is not justice. It's a rush to judgment." Maya watched Carver closely, her sharp mind dissecting every word. The defense attorney was leaning heavily on emotion, attempting to cast doubt on the damning evidence by appealing to the jurors' reluctance to make a final, irrevocable decision. Carver gestured toward Green, who sat stiffly at the defense table, his face pale and his hands fidgeting with a pen. "Officer Green has served this courthouse for 6 years. 6 years of dedicated service ensuring the safety and order of this institution. Is it fair to let a few complaints overshadow all of that?" When Carver finished, the courtroom was silent. She returned to her seat and Daniel Reyes stood. He adjusted his tie as he approached the jury box, his expression calm but resolute. This was his moment to cement the case, to cut through the fog of the defense's arguments and bring the truth into sharp focus. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reyes began, his voice steady and deliberate, "I want to remind you of what this case is really about. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that power is not abused and that the voices of those who have been wronged are heard." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Over the course of this trial, you've seen evidence that cannot be ignored. Financial records showing clear discrepancies, whistleblowers detailing unethical practices, and yes, a pattern of misconduct from an officer who used his position to intimidate and harass." Reyes turned to the jury, his eyes meeting theirs one by one. "Officer Green and Mr. Hanlon are not victims. They are individuals who made choices. Choices to exploit their power. Choices to silence those who stood in their way. Choices to perpetuate a system that prioritizes privilege over justice." He stepped closer to the jury box, lowering his voice slightly. "This is not about punishing mistakes. This is about holding people accountable for their actions. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, no matter their position or influence." Reyes straightened, his voice rising again. "Today you have the power to make a difference, to stand up for those who have been silenced, to ensure that justice prevails. I urge you to use that power wisely." As the closing arguments concluded, Judge Spencer addressed the jury, issuing her instructions with the same calm authority that had guided the trial. The jurors were dismissed to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied, leaving behind an air of anticipation so thick it was almost tangible. Maya remained in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't need to speak to know that Reyes had done everything he could. Now, the outcome was in the hands of the jury. Hours passed, the minutes dragging by with excruciating slowness. Maya stayed composed, her expression betraying none of the tension she felt. The courthouse bustled with activity outside, but inside the courtroom, the stillness was oppressive. Finally, the bailiff entered, signaling that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled once more, the air electric with anticipation. Green sat at the defense table, his face ashen, while Hanlon maintained a facade of calm that Maya could see was beginning to crack. The jury filed in, their expressions somber. The foreperson stood, holding the small piece of paper that held the outcome of weeks of testimony, evidence, and revelations. The clerk read the verdict aloud, the words slicing through the air with sharp finality. We, the jury, find the defendant, Derek Hanlon, guilty on all counts of corruption and fraud. The room seemed to exhale as a collective murmur swept through the spectators. Maya's gaze shifted to Green, whose face had turned an even paler shade of white. And as for Officer Tyler Green, the clerk continued, we recommend immediate investigation into the allegations of misconduct presented during this trial. As the courtroom erupted into a mix of whispers and exclamations, Maya stood and adjusted her blazer. She turned to see Green frozen in his chair, his head bowed, his hands trembling slightly. For all his bravado, he now looked small and insignificant, a man stripped of the power he had so flagrantly abused. Maya walked past him without a word, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The storm had broken, and the wreckage it left behind was exactly as she had anticipated. Outside the courthouse the sunlight was blinding, but Maya welcomed it. This was only one battle in a much larger fight, but today, justice had been served, and for now, that was enough. The courtroom emptied gradually, but the energy lingered, the verdict a weight on everyone who had witnessed it. Outside the courthouse, reporters and spectators gathered like a storm, their murmurs and questions buzzing through the warm Georgia air. Maya stepped outside, her expression calm and composed, the picture of professionalism. She had no desire to engage with the press. Her work here wasn't about recognition. As she descended the courthouse steps, a voice called out from behind her, "Special Agent Collins." She turned slowly to see Daniel Reyes catching up with her, his tie slightly loosened after the long day. His face was a mix of exhaustion and relief, but his eyes shone with gratitude. "Agent Collins," he said, slightly out of breath, "I just wanted to thank you for everything. We couldn't have gotten here without your testimony." Maya nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "You did the heavy lifting, Mr. Reyes. I was just here to ensure the truth had its chance." Reyes chuckled softly. "Well, you certainly made an impression. Green didn't see that coming." Maya's smile faded slightly, her gaze shifting toward the courthouse doors. People like him rarely do. They get so used to the system protecting them that they forget it can turn against them when the truth comes out. Reyes followed her gaze, nodding solemnly. "Do you think anything will actually happen to him, beyond the investigation?" Maya's expression hardened. "If the Bureau has anything to say about it, yes. He's part of a larger pattern we've been watching, and this trial just gave us the leverage we needed to dig deeper. Green's career is over. Now it's a question of how far the consequences will reach." Reyes hesitated, then extended his hand. "Well, whatever happens, I'm glad you were here. You reminded everyone that justice still means something." Maya shook his hand firmly. "Justice always means something, Mr. Reyes. It's just a matter of whether people are willing to fight for it." A week later, the news broke. Court officer under investigation for misconduct following high-profile corruption trial. The headline blared across news outlets, accompanied by a picture of Tyler Green looking pale and disheveled as he left the courthouse under the scrutiny of reporters. The article detailed the growing list of allegations against him: racial profiling, abuse of authority, harassment, all of which had come to light during the trial. Maya read the article from her office, her expression neutral, but her satisfaction undeniable. Green had been suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation, and the Bureau was already preparing charges against him for multiple civil rights violations. It was only a matter of time before he faced his reckoning in a courtroom of his own. Maya sat at her desk, her office quiet except for the occasional hum of activity from the hallway outside. Files were spread out before her, each one tied to the web of corruption she and her team were unraveling. Hanlon's conviction had opened the floodgates, and new leads were pouring in daily. Contractors, public officials, and even law enforcement officers who had been complicit in his schemes. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. It was Davis. "Collins," she answered. "We got another one," Davis said on the other end. his tone a mix of excitement and urgency. A contractor tied to Hanlon just flipped. He's willing to testify against 2 city officials in exchange for leniency. Maya leaned back in her chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Good. Let's make sure he understands the terms. No leniency unless he gives us everything. You got it, Davis replied. Oh, and by the way, Green's hearing is scheduled for next month. The Bureau wants you there to testify. I'll be there, Maya said firmly. This isn't over yet. Weeks turned into months, and the ripples of the trial continued to spread. Derek Hanlon's appeal was denied, and he began serving a lengthy prison sentence. Tyler Green's misconduct hearing resulted in a dismissal from his position, and the federal charges against him loomed like a dark cloud. Maya attended the hearing, sitting silently in the back as Green tried to defend himself one last time. His arguments fell flat, his attempts to justify his actions dismantled by cold, hard evidence. When the final decision was read, termination and the initiation of criminal charges, Maya felt no joy, only a quiet sense of justice being served. As she left the hearing, Green caught her eye, his face a mixture of anger and desperation. For a brief moment she saw the man he truly was, small, bitter, and powerless. She didn't look back as she walked away. Back in her office, Maya returned to her work. For her, there were no celebrations, no moments of rest. Every victory was just another step in a long, unrelenting fight for justice. She knew the system she served wasn't perfect. It was flawed, messy, and often slow, but she also knew it was worth fighting for. As she closed another file and reached for the next, the sunlight streaming through her window cast a warm glow over her desk. Outside, the world moved on, but inside this office, Maya Collins was already preparing for the next storm. Because justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And as long as people like Green and Hanlon existed, she would keep walking this path. For Maya, the fight was far from over, but today, it was enough to know that the scales of justice had tipped, however briefly, in the right direction. And just like that, justice was served. The officer who thought he could get away with his arrogance and abuse of power was finally held accountable, and the truth prevailed. This story is a powerful reminder that no one is above the law, and courage in the face of injustice can change everything. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice, resilience, and unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps us bring you more stories that inspire and empower. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.